Wealthy CEO cried upon seeing his sterile ex-wife with triplets daughters who called her mommy. Richard gripped his car keys until the metal cut into his palm. The most successful man in Atlanta just discovered his biggest failure. What happens when the woman you abandoned for being broken becomes everything you dreamed of with someone else? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. He built an empire on knowing everything about everyone, until the day he discovered the three little girls who proved he knew nothing at all. The Tesla's engine purred to silence as Houston's humidity wrapped around him like an unwelcome embrace. 6 years of avoiding this city, and fate dragged him back for one night that would rewrite everything he thought he knew. Richard Cole stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, his Italian leather shoes clicking against concrete that had seen better decades. The charity gala invitation felt heavy in his breast pocket, heavier than the guilt he'd carried since the divorce. Atlanta's golden boy, they called him. The man who turned abandoned lots into luxury developments, who made millionaires out of investors brave enough to follow his vision. But tonight, standing in this forgotten Houston neighborhood, he felt like a fraud in an expensive suit. The community center glowed with warm light spilling through windows covered in children's handprints. Inside, voices rose in laughter and conversation, the kind of genuine joy his Atlanta penthouse hadn't heard in years. He checked his Rolex. Fashionably late, as always. Some habits die harder than marriages. He turned toward the building, already rehearsing his networking smile, when movement across the street froze him mid-step. A woman emerged from a small house, painted yellow, like morning sunshine. Even from 50 yards away, even after 6 years of trying to forget, he knew that walk. The way her hips swayed when she was happy. The way she tucked hair behind her ear when she was nervous. Danielle. His chest tightened as 3 little girls burst through the door behind her, their laughter carrying across the street like music he'd never heard. They swarmed around her legs like butterflies around their favorite flower, all dark curls and bright dresses and pure, unfiltered joy. "Mommy, wait for us." The smallest one tugged at Danielle's sundress, her voice high and sweet. "Mommy." The word hit him like a physical blow. His breath left his chest in a rush that made his vision blur. The same woman he had abandoned because she could never give him a family was now surrounded by the very dream he thought she could never fulfill. His hands shook as memories crashed over him like Houston summer storms. The fertility clinic in Chicago. Her tears on expensive sheets. His cruel words during their final fight. What's the point of loving a woman who can't even be a real wife? The doctors had been clear. Multiple specialists had agreed. Danielle's condition made pregnancy impossible. The word they'd used, the word he'd thrown at her like a weapon, echoed in his mind now as he watched 3 living contradictions play hopscotch on the sidewalk. Have you ever walked away from someone, convinced you were right, only to learn you were devastatingly wrong? Richard gripped his car keys until the metal cut into his palm. The most successful man in Atlanta just discovered his biggest failure. What happens when the woman you abandoned for being broken becomes everything you dreamed of with someone else? Stay with me as we uncover how one man's pride destroyed the greatest love of his life. The middle child looked up from her coloring book, and Richard's world tilted off its axis. Those eyes, green with gold flecks, just like his grandmother's, just like his own. The shape of her nose, the stubborn set of her chin, the way she held her head when she was concentrating. His legs felt weak. His mouth went dry. 6 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. Just as he took a step forward, desperate for a closer look, a tall man emerged from the house. Broad shoulders, work-worn hands, the kind of steady presence that made others feel safe. The stranger wrapped a protective arm around Danielle's waist and gave Richard a piercing look across the street, as if daring him to take another step closer. The man said something to Danielle. She looked up sharply, her gaze finding Richard's across 2 lanes of evening traffic. For a moment, time stopped. 6 years collapsed into nothing. He saw recognition flash in her eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like panic. She grabbed the children's hands, pulling them toward the car parked in her driveway. But not before the youngest. A girl who couldn't be older than 6 pointed directly at Richard and said something that made Danielle's face go white. Have you ever judged someone's worth based on what they couldn't give you? Tell me in the comments if you've ever regretted walking away. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his private investigator, the one he'd hired on impulse during the flight to Houston, when guilt and curiosity finally outweighed his pride. Found what you're looking for. You're not going to like it. As the tall stranger's protective arm wrapped tighter around Danielle's waist, Richard realized this was more than coincidence. Something was being kept from him. Something that could ruin his name, his empire, and maybe reveal the darkest betrayal of his life. Some men collect trophies. Others collect the broken pieces left behind and make them whole again. Marcus Williams had been fixing things since he was 12 years old. Broken fences, leaky roofs, wounded hearts. His hands knew how to heal what others had damaged. But standing in Danielle's driveway, watching the ghost from her past lean against a car that cost more than most people's houses, he felt something he'd never experienced before. The fear that some things couldn't be fixed once they'd been broken by the right person. Marcus stood like a human shield between past and present, his carpenter's hands steady on Danielle's shoulders while Richard's manicured fingers trembled against his car door. The distance between them might as well have been an ocean, but the tension stretched tight as a wire ready to snap. "Girls, get in the car," Danielle whispered, her voice barely steady. But 6-year-old Emma was already staring across the street with the kind of brutal honesty that only children possess. "Mommy, that man has your eyes," she announced, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Marcus felt Danielle stiffen under his touch. 3 years of patience, of earning her trust one gentle day at a time, of proving that not all men leave when things get difficult. All of it threatened by a stranger in an expensive suit who couldn't even cross the street to face what he'd left behind. Richard took a step forward, then stopped as Marcus shifted his stance. The message was clear without words. You lost the right to look at her like that the day you chose your pride over her heart. "Who is he, baby?" Marcus asked quietly, though he already knew. Danielle had told him everything during their second year together, on a night when too much wine had loosened the locks she kept on her deepest wounds. The husband who'd walked away. The man who'd called her broken. The one who'd convinced her she wasn't worth staying for. "No one important," Danielle said, but her hands shook as she fumbled with her car keys. "Just someone from a long time ago." Emma pressed her face against Marcus's leg, still staring at the stranger. "He looks sad, Daddy Marcus." "Why does he look so sad?" The word daddy hit Marcus in the chest like a blessing and a curse. These weren't his children by blood, but he'd earned the title through midnight fevers and scraped knees, through bedtime stories and patient homework help, through being present when their biological father had been too proud to even try. What would you do if your ex showed up after years of silence? Would you give them a chance to explain or protect your peace? Drop a comment below. Richard's phone buzzed, but he didn't look away from the scene unfolding in Danielle's driveway. His investigator had promised answers, but watching Marcus guide his family into their modest Honda, Richard realized he might not want to hear what he'd paid to discover. The middle child, Grace, climbed in her car seat but rolled down the window as her mother started the engine. "Are you coming to our school play next week?" she called to Marcus. "You promised to help me with my costume." "Wouldn't miss it, sweetheart," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the kind of easy affection that comes from years of shared routines and unforced love. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. School plays. Costumes. The daily magic of raising children that he'd convinced himself he didn't want because he thought he couldn't have it. As Danielle's car pulled out of the driveway, Emma's face appeared in the rear window. She waved at Richard with the fearless friendliness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. He raised his hand automatically, waving back before he could stop himself. The simple gesture felt like stepping off a cliff. Marcus waited until the Honda disappeared around the corner before walking across the street. Up close, Richard could see the calluses on the other man's hands, the sun lines around his eyes, the kind of genuine strength that came from building things instead of just buying them. "Richard Cole," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question. You know who I am. I know what you did." Marcus's voice stayed level, but steel ran underneath the calm. "I know you walked away from the best woman in the world because she couldn't give you something that wasn't her fault. I know you made her believe she wasn't enough." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about our marriage." "I know enough." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that Richard could smell sawdust and honest sweat instead of expensive cologne. "I know she still flinches sometimes when men raise their voices. I know she apologizes for things that aren't her fault. I know she spent 2 years in therapy learning to believe she deserved love again." The words hit their mark. Richard's wealth, his success, his carefully constructed new life. None of it mattered in the face of the damage he'd left behind. "Those children," Richard started, "are none of your business," Marcus finished. "You made that choice 6 years ago." The youngest girl looked up from her coloring book and pointed directly at Richard. "Mommy," she said in a voice that cut through traffic noise, "that man has your eyes." Marcus's face went pale as the implication hit him. He looked at Richard with new understanding and something that might have been pity. "Jesus Christ, Marcus Vispirid. You don't even know, do you? DNA doesn't care about divorce papers, and neither do the eyes of a child who's never met her father." The coffee shop on Main Street had seen better decades, but its cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lights provided the kind of anonymity that expensive restaurants couldn't offer. At 11 p.m., only shift workers and insomniacs occupied the scattered tables, giving Richard and Marcus an unlikely privacy for the conversation that would change everything. Marcus slid a manila envelope across the chipped Formica table. His face had aged 10 years in the hour since they'd left Danielle's neighborhood, the weight of secrets finally too heavy to carry alone. "She made me promise never to tell you," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "But after seeing those girls tonight, after watching Emma point at you like she was looking in a mirror, I can't be part of this anymore." Richard's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Birth certificates. 3 of them. His throat closed as he read the dates. All from the same day, 6 years ago. All listing Danielle Parker as mother. All listing father unknown. The coffee shop window became a two-way mirror of revelation. Him staring in at the family he never knew existed, them staring out at the ghost of a life they'd built without him. "Triplets," Richard whispered. The word felt foreign on his tongue. "Emma, Grace, and Sophia," Marcus confirmed. "Born 4 months after your divorce was finalized. Emergency C-section at 32 weeks. They spent 6 weeks in the NICU, while Danielle worked 2 jobs to pay the medical bills." Richard's vision blurred. He'd been closing his biggest deal of the year that spring, celebrating in Cabo while his daughters, fought for their lives in incubators. "The medical trial," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "The one that made pregnancy possible for her. She found out about it 2 weeks after you left. But by the time she knew she was carrying your babies, you'd already made it clear what you thought of her worth as a woman." The memory hit Richard like a physical blow. Their last fight. Her pleading with him to stay, to try the experimental treatment one more time. His cruel response, "I'm not wasting any more years on damaged goods." Damaged goods. God, what kind of monster had he been? Have you ever discovered a life-changing truth too late, when the damage was already done? Share your story below. "She was scared," Marcus said, watching Richard's face crumble. "Scared you'd take them away out of spite. Or worse, that you'd reject them like you rejected her. So she moved here, started over. Build a life where those girls would never have to wonder why their father didn't want them." Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his investigator. Hospital records attached. "Prepare yourself." The medical files painted a picture that destroyed him. Danielle's pregnancy complications. The premature labor brought on by stress and overwork. Her working as a waitress until the day she went into labor because she had no one to help support her. Because he'd thrown her away like garbage. "Where were you?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "When they were born?" Marcus's face softened. "I didn't meet Danielle until the girls were 2. She was working at the diner, trying to finish her nursing degree online during her breaks. Emma had just gotten over pneumonia, and Danielle looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. You helped her. I fell in love with her. With all of them. Marcus's voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of devotion. I taught Sophia to ride a bike. I helped Grace with her math homework. I held Emma when she had nightmares. Each revelation cut deeper than the last. Richard had missed first steps, first words, first days of school. He'd been building his empire while his daughters built their lives around the absence he'd created. Do they know about me? Marcus shook his head. They know their biological father lives far away. Danielle told them he wasn't ready to be a daddy yet. She's protected your reputation even after what you did to her. Protected his reputation, while he'd been telling anyone who'd listened that his ex-wife was the problem in their marriage. That he'd had to leave because she couldn't fulfill a woman's basic function. Richard's chest tightened with shame, so profound it felt like drowning. The girls, they call you. Richard couldn't finish the sentence. Daddy Marcus, he confirmed. And I've earned that title every single day for 3 years. Through stomach bugs and dance recitals, through scraped knees and broken toys. I've been their father in every way that matters. Except biologically. Biology doesn't tuck children in a bed at night. Marcus snapped. It doesn't kiss away tears or teach them to be kind. You donated sperm. Richard, I raised daughters. The truth hit like a sledgehammer. Richard had spent 6 years convincing himself he'd made the right choice, that he'd escaped a burden that would have held him back. Instead, he'd abandoned 3 little girls who deserved better than a father too proud to stay and fight for them. What do you want from me? Richard asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who'd thrown away what he'd spent 3 years trying to heal. I want you to understand something, Marcus finally said. Those aren't just any children, Richard. Those are your children, the ones you said she could never give you. And tomorrow morning, I have to go home and look Danielle in the eye, knowing that the family I've helped build could disappear because you finally decided to show up. Danielle's hand shook as she speed-dialed her lawyer. He's here. Richard's here. And I think he knows. On the other end, the lawyer's voice carried a weight that chilled her. There's something you need to know about the custody laws in Texas. She thought hiding the truth would protect her children, until the day she learned that secrets are just weapons waiting for the right enemy to find them. The law office smelled of leather and power, where justice wore expensive suits and mercy came with hourly rates that could fund small countries. At 7 a.m., Patricia Hernandez, Danielle's court-appointed attorney during the divorce, looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Sit down, Danielle, Patricia said, gesturing to the chair across from her mahogany desk. We need to talk about Texas custody law, and you're not going to like what I have to say. Danielle clutched her coffee cup like a lifeline. She'd left the girls with her neighbor, telling them Mommy had an early appointment. Emma had hugged her extra tight, as if sensing the storm clouds gathering around their carefully constructed world. He can't just take them, Danielle said. He walked away. He has no claim to them. Patricia pulled out a thick legal folder, her expression grim. In Texas, biological fathers have significant parental rights, regardless of their previous involvement. If Richard can prove paternity through DNA testing, which he can, he has legal standing to petition for custody. The words felt like ice water in Danielle's veins. But I raised them. I've been their only parent for 6 years. And that matters. But the law doesn't see abandonment the way we do emotionally. Richard can argue he didn't know about the children's existence. That changes everything legally. Danielle's hands trembled as she set down her coffee. 3 years of building security, of creating a stable home, of convincing her daughters they were loved and wanted, all of it threatened by a man who'd thrown her away for being defective. What are my options? Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. The truth? Not many. Richard has unlimited resources. He can hire the best custody attorneys in Texas. He can drag this out for years. And every day it continues is another day your girls live in uncertainty. So I should just hand them over to a man who called me barren, who said I wasn't woman enough to deserve a family. I'm not saying that. Patricia's voice softened with something that looked like sympathy. I'm saying you need to prepare for the possibility that he might get joint custody, maybe even primary custody, if he can prove he can provide better opportunities. Better opportunities. The phrase tasted like poison in Danielle's mouth. Richard could offer private schools, designer clothes, college funds that would set the girls up for life. What could she offer? A cramped apartment, secondhand clothes, and all the love in the world, which apparently wasn't enough in the eyes of Texas law. There's something else, Patricia continued. Richard already has an attorney, David Morrison from Houston's most expensive family law firm. He filed preliminary paperwork yesterday requesting an emergency custody evaluation. Danielle's vision blurred. Emergency evaluation? What does that mean? It means a social worker will visit your home, interview the children, assess their living conditions. They'll compare your resources to Richard's. And Danielle, a man who owns half of Atlanta's commercial real estate, is going to look very good on paper. What lengths would you go to protect your children from someone who hurt you? Is blood always thicker than time? Tell me your thoughts. The door to Patricia's office opened without warning. A tall man in a suit that cost more than Danielle's car walked in, followed by Richard. Seeing her ex-husband in person, in daylight, after 6 years of trying to forget his face, hit her like a physical blow. He looked older, lines around his eyes, silver threading through his dark hair. But those eyes, the same green eyes that stared back at her from 3 little faces every morning, those eyes held something she'd never seen before. Regret. Ms. Parker, the expensive lawyer said, his voice smooth as silk. I'm David Morrison, representing Mr. Cole. We'd like to discuss a custody arrangement that benefits everyone involved, especially the children. Get out, Danielle whispered. Richard stepped forward. Danielle, please. We need to talk about. Get out. The words tore from her throat like a battle cry. You don't get to walk into my lawyer's office. You don't get to disrupt my life again. And you sure as hell don't get to use legal loopholes to steal my children. Our children, Richard said quietly. The word hit the room like a bomb. Our. As if he had any right to claim ownership of lives he'd never touched, never held, never loved. You gave up that right. Danielle stood, her voice shaking with 6 years of suppressed rage. The day you told me I was too broken to be worth staying for. Richard's face went white. Behind him, his expensive lawyer shifted uncomfortably, probably realizing his client had more baggage than a simple custody case usually carried. I was wrong, Richard said. I was cruel and selfish and wrong. But that doesn't change the fact that they're my daughters too. Biology doesn't make you a father, Danielle shot back. Marcus is their father. He's the one who earned that title. And where's Marcus now? Morrison interrupted smoothly. Because my understanding is that he's not legally married to you, has no adoption papers, and therefore has no parental rights whatsoever. The lawyer's words hit their target with surgical precision. Marcus had been talking about proposing, about making their unconventional family official. But they'd had time, or so they thought. Time to let the girls adjust, time to be certain, time that had just run out. Patricia cleared her throat. Mr. Morrison, this is highly irregular. You can't just barge into opposing counsel's office. We're not opposing counsel yet. Morrison smiled like a shark. We're hoping to avoid court entirely through reasonable negotiation. What do you want? Danielle asked, though she dreaded the answer. Richard spoke before his lawyer could. I want all my daughters. I want to be part of their lives. I want to make up for 6 years of being an idiot. And if I refuse? Morrison's smile turned cold. Then we go to court, and I promise you a mess. Parker, the resources at my disposal will make this very unpleasant for everyone involved, including 3 little girls who will be caught in the middle. As Richard's attorney slid the DNA test results across the marble table, his words hit like a physical blow. Congratulations, Mr. Cole. You're the father of triplets. And under Texas law, you have rights she can't take away. The man who walked away because she was barren just discovered he was the father of triplets, and the woman he abandoned had been protecting his children from him. The DNA lab in downtown Houston looked like something from a science fiction movie. All gleaming chrome and sterile white surfaces that reflected Richard's guilt back at him from every angle. Dr. Amanda Chun held the test results with the casual indifference of someone who delivered life-changing news for a living. 99.99% probability of paternity, she announced, sliding the papers across her desk. Congratulations, Mr. Cole. You're definitely the biological father of Emma, Grace, and Sophia Parker. Richard stared at the numbers that confirmed what his heart had known the moment he saw Emma's eyes. The same eyes that stared back at him from his childhood photos. The same stubborn chin that had gotten him into trouble as a boy. The same dimples that appeared when he smiled. Though he couldn't remember the last time he'd had reason to. His hands trembled as he processed the medical terminology that translated to the simplest, most devastating truth. He had thrown away 3 daughters because his pride mattered more than waiting for a miracle. The hospital records spread across his mahogany desk like evidence of his own failure. 3 birth certificates, 3 tiny footprints, 3 lives he'd missed because he'd been too proud to stay. Marcus had been right. Biology didn't make him a father. But genetics had made him responsible for 3 little girls who called another man daddy, while their real father had spent 6 years convincing himself he'd dodged a bullet. His phone buzzed with a text from Morrison, his attorney. Court date set for Thursday. Emergency custody hearing. Be prepared to explain 6 years of absence. 6 years. He'd built an empire in that time, acquired properties worth hundreds of millions, been featured on magazine covers as one of Atlanta's most eligible bachelors. And while he was collecting accolades and accumulating wealth, his daughters were learning to walk, talk, read, all without him. The penthouse elevator opened with its usual whisper-quiet efficiency, but the familiar luxury felt like a prison now. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Atlanta's glittering skyline, each light representing lives being lived, families being built, children being loved by parents who showed up. Richard poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey. The expensive kind that tasted like accomplishment, but tonight it burned like regret going down. The investigator's full report lay open on his granite kitchen counter. Photos of Danielle working double shifts as a waitress while her belly grew round with his children. Hospital bills that would have bankrupted most people. A tiny apartment where she'd somehow managed to create a home filled with laughter and love. If someone hurt you deeply, would you tell them about the children they helped create? Or would you protect your babies from their rejection? What would you choose? The worst part wasn't what he'd missed. It was what Danielle had endured alone. The report detailed her pregnancy complications, brought on by stress and overwork. The premature labor that nearly killed all 3 babies. The months of NICU bills while she worked 2 jobs and finished nursing school. All because he called her damaged goods and walked away. Richard's reflection stared back at him from the dark windows, and for the first time in years, he didn't like what he saw. Success looked different when measured against abandoned children. Wealth felt meaningless when counted in missed bedtime stories. His laptop chimed with an email from Morrison's office. Security footage from the hospital where the girls were born. Grainy black and white images of Danielle, alone, being wheeled into the delivery room at 3 a.m. No husband holding her hand. No partner talking her through the contractions. Just a 28-year-old woman facing the scariest moment of her life because the man who'd promised to love her had decided she wasn't worth the effort. The footage showed her leaving the hospital 6 weeks later, 3 car seats crowded into the back of an ancient Honda, her face gaunt with exhaustion and determination. She'd been beautiful once, the kind of natural beauty that made heads turn in restaurants. But in those grainy images, she looked like a survivor of something terrible. Which, Richard realized she'd survived him. His phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and Richard almost didn't answer. What do you say to the man who stepped up when you stepped out? She's not sleeping, Marcus said without preamble. She's been awake for 3 days, terrified you're going to show up with court papers and rip those girls away from the only stable home they've ever known. That's not what I want. What you want doesn't matter anymore. Marcus's voice carried the weight of 3 years spent earning the right to speak for this family. What matters is what's best for Emma, Grace, and Sophia. And having their world destroyed by a custody battle, isn't it? Richard closed his eyes. I just want to know them. You had 6 years to know them. You chose money instead. I didn't know they existed, because you made it impossible for Danielle to tell you. You think she kept them secret out of spite? She kept them secret out of survival. She knew exactly what kind of man you were, the kind who throws away women who can't give him what he wants immediately. The accusation hit its mark because it was true. Richard had always been a man who dealt in certainties, who cut losses quickly and moved on to the next opportunity. But children weren't business deals. Love wasn't a commodity to be traded when it stopped performing. The girls, Richard said quietly, do they ask about their biological father? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Emma does. She's the most like you, stubborn, curious, determined to understand everything. She asks why her daddy lives so far away, why he doesn't visit, why he doesn't call. What does Danielle tell her? That some people aren't ready to be parents yet. That it doesn't mean he doesn't love her, it just means he has things to figure out first. Even in her anger, even after everything he'd done, Danielle had protected him in his daughter's eyes. She'd given him the benefit of doubt he'd never given her. Marcus, Richard said, his voice cracking, I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it, Marcus replied. You can only decide what kind of man you want to be moving forward. The knock on Danielle's door came at midnight. Not Richard with his usual scheduled visit, but a social worker with court papers. Ma'am, we have a temporary custody evaluation order. I need to see the children's living conditions. Tonight. As the call ended, Richard stared at his reflection in the dark window and realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was facing a problem that money couldn't solve and pride had created. The question wasn't whether he deserved his daughter's love. She built a fortress of love around her daughters, but fortresses can't stop the law from knocking down your door at midnight. The knock echoed through Danielle's apartment at 11:47 p.m., sharp and official in a way that made her blood turn cold. She just finished tucking Emma into bed after another round of, why can't Daddy Marcus live with us? Questions that broke her heart a little more each time. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in a cheap suit holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of tired expression that came from delivering bad news for a living. Ms. Parker? I'm Janet Rodriguez from Child Protective Services. I have a court order for an emergency custody evaluation. Danielle's hand shook as she opened the door, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. 3 sleepy girls in princess pajamas watched strangers examine their bedrooms, their toys, their safe space violated by clipboards and legal authority that turned love into evidence. Is this really necessary at midnight? Danielle asked, wrapping her robe tighter around herself as the social worker photographed Emma's bedroom. Janet looked up from her notes, sympathy flickering in her tired eyes. Emergency orders don't wait for business hours, ma'am. Mr. Cole's attorney argued that immediate evaluation was necessary to ensure the children's well-being. The children's well-being. As if Richard suddenly cared about their well-being after 6 years of pretending they didn't exist. Grace peeked out from behind her mother's legs, clutching her stuffed elephant. Mommy, are the bad people taking us away? The question hit Danielle like a punch to the chest. Her 6-year-old daughter shouldn't have to worry about being taken from the only home she'd ever known. Shouldn't have to fear that loving her meant losing her. No, baby, Danielle whispered, smoothing Grace's curls. These people are just checking to make sure you're safe and happy. But Janet's expression told a different story. Her notes documented everything. The cramped space, the secondhand furniture, the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter that Danielle hadn't been able to hide in time. The children seem healthy and well cared for, Janet said, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen better situations. However, the court will need to consider all factors when determining custody arrangements. All factors. Code words for Richard's mansion versus Danielle's apartment. His unlimited resources versus her paycheck-to-paycheck existence. His potential versus her reality. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes, sawdust in his hair, and panic in his eyes. He'd been installing kitchen cabinets across town when Danielle called, voice breaking as she explained what was happening. Have you ever felt powerless against a system that treated your family like a case number? How did you fight back? Share your strength with others below. This is my partner, Danielle said as Marcus wrapped his arms around her. He's been helping raise the girls for 3 years. Janet made a note. Are you legally married, Mr. Williams? And no, not yet. But I've been their father in every way that matters. The court recognizes legal relationships, Mr. Williams. Good intentions don't carry the same weight as legal documents. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 3 years of midnight fevers, scraped knees, homework help, and bedtime stories. None of it mattered in the eyes of the law because he'd never gotten around to proposing, never made their relationship official. Sophia wandered out of her bedroom, rubbing her eyes with tiny fists. At 6 years old, she was the peacemaker of the family, always trying to fix whatever was wrong. Why is everyone sad? She asked, climbing into Marcus's lap with the trust of a child who'd never doubted his love. Janet watched the interaction, making notes about the obvious affection between Marcus and the children. But Danielle could see the conflict in her eyes, the social worker's personal feelings battling against legal requirements that didn't care about love when biology came calling. The biological father has significant rights in Texas, Janet explained quietly while the girls played in the living room, especially when he can provide financial stability. Financial stability. The phrase that reduced 6 years of love and sacrifice to a number on a bank statement. He abandoned us, Danielle said, her voice barely controlled. He called me broken and walked away. How is that financial stability? That was before he knew about the children, Janet replied, her tone suggesting she'd heard this argument before. The court will focus on his ability to provide for them now, not on past relationship issues. Past relationship issues. As if emotional abuse was just a minor disagreement that time had healed, Marcus stood up, Sophia still in his arms, and faced Janet with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of protecting what mattered. Those girls have never spent a night without knowing they were loved, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. They've never wondered if they were wanted, never felt like burdens. That man may share their DNA, but I'm the one who taught them to ride bikes, who kisses away their tears, who reads them bedtime stories every single night. Janet's pen stopped moving. For a moment, the official mask slipped, and Danielle glimpsed the woman underneath, someone who'd probably seen too many children caught between adults who cared more about winning than loving. Mr. Williams, Janet said softly, your dedication is obvious, but the law is clear about biological parents' rights. Even when those biological parents prove they can't be trusted with love. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was already burning everything down. As Janet finished her documentation, Emma appeared beside Danielle, having listened to more than a 6-year-old should have to hear. Mommy, she whispered, tugging on Danielle's pajama sleeve. Is our real daddy going to make us live with him instead of Daddy Marcus? The innocent question broke something inside Danielle that no amount of legal maneuvering could fix. Her daughter shouldn't have to choose between the father who raised her and the stranger who made her. I don't know, sweetheart, Danielle admitted, because lying to her children about this felt like another betrayal. After Janet left, Marcus held Danielle on their worn couch while 3 little girls finally fell back asleep. But sleep wouldn't come for the adults who understood that love might not be enough to keep their family together. What if he wins? Danielle whispered against Marcus's chest. Then we fight, Marcus replied, his voice carrying a determination that surprised them both. We fight for them, and we fight for us, and we don't give up until the last appeal is filed. As a social worker's car disappeared into the night, Danielle's phone rang, Richard's number. We need to talk. His voice was different now, broken. Not as enemies, as parents. Because I just realized what I've done to my own children. Some apologies are too big for words. They require a complete reconstruction of a man's soul. The all-night diner on Highway 6 buzzed with shift workers and insomniacs, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on a conversation that should have happened years ago in the comfort of their shared bedroom. At 2 a.m., Richard sat across from Danielle in a cracked vinyl booth, both of them looking like survivors of separate disasters. He'd called her at midnight, his voice broken in ways she'd never heard before. Not angry broken like during their divorce, but devastated broken, like a man who'd finally seen himself clearly and didn't like the reflection. I saw the social worker's report, Richard said, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't touched. I saw what happened to our girls tonight because of me. Our girls. The phrase should have felt like an intrusion, but exhaustion had worn down Danielle's defenses until only truth remained. They were terrified, she said, her voice flat with the kind of tire that sleep couldn't fix. Emma asked me if the bad people were taking them away. A 6-year-old shouldn't have to worry about strangers deciding her fate. Richard's face crumpled. I never meant for them to get hurt. What did you think would happen when you sicked lawyers on us? That we'd just hand over 3 children to a man they've never met. The words hit their mark. Richard had spent his career making calculated moves, predicting outcomes, controlling variables. But children weren't business deals, and families didn't operate on corporate logic. I called you barren. The confession tore from his throat like something that had been rotting inside him for years. I made you feel broken. I walked away from the woman I loved because I was too proud to wait for a miracle. And the miracle happened anyway, without me. Danielle stared at the table, memories washing over her like acid rain. The fertility clinics, the failed treatments, his growing coldness as each month passed without the pregnancy they both wanted. You made me believe I wasn't enough, she whispered, that my worth as a woman was tied to my ability to give you children. I know. You told me I was damaged goods. I know. You said you couldn't waste more years on someone who couldn't be a real wife. I know. The words exploded from him, loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. I know what I said. I know what I did. And I've spent 6 years trying to convince myself I was right when I was the most wrong a man could be. What does a real apology sound like to you? When someone has caused deep pain, what would it take for you to even consider forgiveness? Tell me below. Richard's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos that had been sent by his investigator. Images of Danielle pregnant and alone. Hospital records showing premature labor brought on by stress. Bills that would have bankrupted most people while she worked 2 jobs and finished nursing school. I was in Cabo when they were born, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Celebrating my biggest deal of the year, while my daughters fought for their lives in the NICU. They weren't your daughters then, Danielle said coldly. You made your choice. I made the wrong choice. The worst choice. The kind of choice that ruins lives and breaks families and turns good men into monsters. A waitress refilled their coffee cups, pretending not to notice the tears on Richard's cheeks or the way Danielle's hands trembled when she lifted her cup. Why now? Danielle asked. Why do you suddenly care about being a father? Richard was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the empty parking lot where his Tesla sat next to her Honda like symbols of everything that divided them. Because I saw Emma point at me and say I had your eyes, he finally answered. And for the first time in 6 years, I realized what I'd thrown away. Not just you, them. 3 little girls who should have known their father's love from the day they were born. They know love, Danielle said fiercely. Marcus loves them. They love him. We're a family. I know. And that's what kills me most. They have everything I should have given them, from a man who was brave enough to stay when I was too cowardly to wait. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. I don't want to hurt them, Richard continued. I don't want to disrupt their lives, or confuse them, or make them choose between the father who raised them and the stranger who shares their DNA. Then what do you want? Richard's voice cracked completely. I want to earn the right to love them. I want to prove I'm not the man who walked away. I want to be worthy of calling them my daughters. And if you can't, if they're better off without you. The question hit like a physical blow, but Richard didn't flinch from it. Then I'll walk away again. But this time, I'll do it for them, not for me. Danielle studied his face, looking for the lies and manipulation she'd learned to expect from him. But all she saw was genuine anguish, a man who'd finally understood the cost of his choices. They ask about their biological father sometimes, she said quietly. Emma especially. She wants to know why he lives far away, why he doesn't visit. What do you tell her? That some people aren't ready to be parents when they first become parents. That it doesn't mean he doesn't love her. Even in her anger, even after everything he'd done, she protected him in his daughter's eyes. She'd given him grace he'd never given her. "They have his eyes," Richard whispered. "All three of them. Your kindness, but my eyes. Emma has your stubbornness too. And Grace has your way of tilting her head when she's thinking. Sophia." Danielle's voice softened despite herself. "Sophia has your smile. The real one, not the fake one you used with clients." For a moment, they weren't divorced spouses fighting over custody. They were parents talking about children they both loved, even if one of them had love from a distance of years and miles and terrible choices. When she finally looked up from her untouched coffee, tears streaming down her face, her words cut deeper than any revenge. "They ask about their daddy sometimes. I tell them he lives far away. I never told them he threw us away before they were even born." The truth settled between them like broken glass, sharp, irreparable, but finally visible in the harsh fluorescent light. He spent 6 years running from the idea of fatherhood. Then 3 little voices saying hello brought him to his knees. The community center playground had seen better decades, but Saturday morning sunlight made everything look possible again. Richard sat on a bench that probably violated several safety codes, watching Marcus push 3 little girls on swings that squeaked with each arc through the morning air. This was his compromise with Danielle. Supervised visits in public places where the girls felt safe, and he couldn't overwhelm them with the desperation that had been eating him alive since that first night outside their house. "Are you ready for this?" Danielle asked, sitting beside him on the weathered bench. She'd been quiet during the drive from her apartment, her hands clenched in her lap like she was preparing for surgery. "No, Richardan Serdanistli. How do you prepare to meet your children for the first time when they're already 6 years old?" The community center playground became hallowed ground as 3 6-year-olds approached the stranger who shared their DNA like tiny ambassadors of possibility. Emma came first because she was the brave one, the leader, the one who asked hard questions and demanded real answers. She stood 3 feet away from Richard, studying his face with the kind of serious attention that reminded him of himself at that age. "You're him," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the confidence of someone who'd inherited his determination. "I'm him," Richard confirmed, his voice barely steady. "Mommy said you live far away." "Ido. I live in Atlanta." "Why?" The question every 6-year-old asked about everything, but this time it carried the weight of years of absence and the promise of truth that children deserved. "Because I made some bad choices before you were born," Richard said, crouching down to her eye level. "Choices I wish I could change." Grace hung back, clutching Marcus's hand, but her curiosity was stronger than her shyness. She had Danielle's gentle nature, but Richard's intelligence burning behind those familiar green eyes. "Are you really our daddy?" she asked, the word daddy coming out tentative, like she wasn't sure she had permission to use it. The question hit Richard in the chest like a sledgehammer. "I'm your biological father," he said carefully, "but Marcus is your daddy. He's the one who reads you bedtime stories and kisses your scraped knees." Sophia, the youngest by 12 minutes, but old enough to sense the emotional undercurrents flowing between the adults, approached with the kind of caution that broke Richard's heart. "Why do you live so far away?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Richard's throat closed. How do you explain pride and selfishness and cowardice to someone who still believed in fairy tales? "Because I was scared," he said, the truth feeling foreign on his tongue. "I was scared of being a daddy, so I ran away instead of staying to learn how." Have you ever met someone important for the first time, even though they've been part of your life all along? What was that moment like? Share below. Marcus approached slowly, his protective instincts warring with the recognition that these children needed answers only their biological father could provide. "Girls," Marcus said gently, "why don't you show Richard your favorite part of the playground?" What followed was a tour led by 3 6-year-olds who took their responsibilities as guides very seriously. Emma showed him the monkey bars she could cross without help. Grace demonstrated how high she could swing without getting scared. Sophia shared her secret hiding spot under the slide, where she went when she needed to think. Each revelation felt like a gift Richard hadn't earned, but desperately wanted to deserve. "I can put my legs really high," Emma announced, demonstrating her swinging technique with the pride of someone who'd mastered a difficult skill. "That's amazing," Richard said, and meant it. "When did you learn to do that?" "Daddy Marcus taught me," she replied without hesitation. "He teaches us lots of things." There it was, the reality that another man had filled the space Richard had abandoned. Marcus had taught them to swim, to ride bikes, to be kind to others. He'd been present for first days of school, lost teeth, and scraped knees. But watching his daughters, play in the morning sunlight, Richard felt something he'd never experienced before. Not the proud ownership he'd imagined fatherhood would bring, but something deeper and more terrifying. Pure, unconditional love for three little people he'd only just met. "Do you want to push us?" Grace asked, her shyness melting as curiosity took over. Richard looked at Marcus, who nodded with the kind of grace that made shame burn in Richard's chest. This man had every reason to hate him, to keep him away from the family he'd built from the pieces Richard had left behind. Instead, Marcus stepped aside, giving Richard space to discover what he'd been missing. The first push was tentative, his hands unfamiliar with the weight and trust of a child depending on him. But Grace laughed, a sound that rewrote everything Richard thought he knew about success and fulfillment. And suddenly he understood what mattered. Not the empire he'd built, not the deals he'd closed, not the magazines that had featured him as Atlanta's most eligible bachelor. This giggling 6-year-old who trusted him not to let her fall. "Higher," Sophia called from the swing beside her sister. "I want to touch the clouds." Richard's laugh surprised them both. When was the last time he'd laughed without calculating the social benefit? When was the last time joy had been this simple? "Mommy cries sometimes," Emma announced from her swing, the kind of brutal honesty that only children possess. "When she thinks we're sleeping." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "Why does Mommy cry?" "Because she misses you," Emma said matter-of-factly. She told Daddy Marcus she wishes things were different. Richard's hands stilled on the swing chains. Danielle missed him? After everything he'd done, everything he'd said, she still carried some fragment of what they'd once been. "Do you miss me too?" he asked before he could stop himself. Emma considered the question with 6-year-old seriousness. How can you miss someone you never met? The logic was flawless and devastating. How do you mourn the absence of someone who chose not to be present? "But," Emma continued, "I always wondered what you looked like. If you had the same eyes as us. If you were tall like Daddy Marcus. And now you know?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Now I know you have sad eyes. Like Mommy's when she thinks we're not looking." As visiting hours ended and 3 little girls hugged him goodbye, the youngest whispered in his ear, "Daddy, are you going to leave again?" The question hit him like a physical blow, because for the first time in his life, Richard Cole didn't know the answer. But he knew he wanted to find out. He built his fortune by making hard choices. But choosing between his empire and his family was the first decision that truly mattered. The Atlanta skyline glittered through Richard's penthouse windows like diamonds he no longer cared to possess, while 3 crayon drawings from Texas glowed more precious than any contract on his marble desk. Emma had drawn a family of stick figures: Mommy, Daddy Marcus, and 3 little girls holding hands under a rainbow. No father figure that looked like him. Richard's phone buzzed with its 4th urgent call from his business partner in an hour. The board meeting he'd missed. The deals that needed his signature. The empire that demanded his constant attention while his heart pulled him toward a playground in Houston where his daughters asked questions he didn't know how to answer. "Richard, where the hell are you?" James Morrison's voice crackled through the speaker, frustration bleeding through the expensive phone's clarity. "The Singapore investors flew in specifically to meet with you." "Reschedule," Richard said, not looking away from Grace's drawing of a princess who looked suspiciously like Danielle. "Reschedule? This is a $200 million deal. You don't reschedule $200 million deals. $200 million. 6 months ago, that number would have made his pulse race with excitement. Now it felt like play money compared to the real wealth he'd discovered in Houston. 3 little girls who might someday call him daddy if he proved worthy of the title. The conversation continued with James listing everything Richard was jeopardizing by his absence, but the words washed over him like background noise. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see other buildings, other penthouses, other men who'd chosen success over family and convinced themselves they'd won. Had any of them ever watched their 6-year-old daughter master the monkey bars? Had any of them felt the trust of small hands, depending on them not to let go? What would you sacrifice for a second chance at love and family? Your career? Your reputation? Everything? Tell me what matters most to you. Richard? Richard, are you listening to me? James, Richard interrupted, his voice calm in a way that surprised them both. I need to ask you something. Do you love your kids? Silence. Then, what does that have to do with the Singapore deal? Everything, Richard realized. It has everything to do with everything. His laptop chimed with another urgent email from his assistant. 3 more meetings he'd missed. A conference call with investors who were starting to question his commitment. A board of directors who'd built their own fortunes on Richard's reliable presence and strategic genius. But genius felt different when measured against 6-year-old Emma, asking why he lived so far away. Strategy seemed meaningless when compared to Sophia's whispered question about whether he was going to leave again. The photo on his desk, taken just last week at the playground, showed him pushing Grace on a swing, both of them laughing at something she'd said about clouds having feelings. It was the first picture of himself he'd looked at in years where he actually recognized the man in the frame. That man looked happy. That man looked like he belonged somewhere that mattered. His phone rang again. This time it was Margaret Chun, the board's chairwoman and his mentor for the past decade. Richard, we need to talk. Her voice carried the weight of someone delivering an ultimatum. The board is concerned about your recent absences, your lack of focus on critical deals. Margaret, let me finish. You've built something extraordinary here, but empires require emperors who show up. If you can't commit to being present, we'll need to discuss your role moving forward. The threat was clear. Stay and run the empire he'd built, or lose controlling interest in the company that bore his name. 6 months ago, the choice would have been automatic. His business was his identity, his worth measured in quarterly profits and Forbes rankings. Now, staring at his daughter's artwork, Richard felt something shift inside his chest like a lock finally clicking open. Margaret, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. What if I told you I found something more valuable than the Singapore deal? I'd say you've lost your mind. Maybe I have, or maybe I finally found it. The conversation that followed would reshape everything. Margaret's increasing frustration as Richard explained his situation. The board's ultimatum delivered with corporate politeness but steel underneath. Return to Atlanta and full-time leadership, or step back from day-to-day operations. Choose the empire or choose the family he'd abandoned and was desperate to reclaim. You're talking about walking away from everything you've built, Margaret said, her voice mixing disbelief with disappointment. For what? A custody battle with your ex-wife? For 3 little girls who deserve a father who shows up, Richard replied. For a chance to be the man I should have been 6 years ago. And if it doesn't work out? If this family reunion fantasy falls apart? The question Richard had been avoiding finally demanded an answer. What if Danielle never forgave him? What if his daughters grew up calling Marcus daddy, while he remained the stranger who disrupted their lives? What if love wasn't enough to bridge 6 years of absence and a lifetime of bad choices? Then at least I'll know I tried, he said. At least I'll know I chose them over money for once in my life. Late-night phone calls with Danielle about the children had been turning into deeper conversations, old intimacy creeping back despite the legal battles and custody evaluations. Last night, she'd called him crying because Emma had asked why families had to be so complicated. She said she wishes you and Marcus could be friends, Danielle had whispered through tears. She wants to know why the people who love her can't love each other. From the mouths of babes came the questions that cut deepest. Why couldn't adults figure out what children understood instinctively? That love should bring people together, not tear them apart. Richard's assistant knocked on his office door, her expression carefully neutral as she delivered the morning's agenda. Meetings he wouldn't attend, calls he wouldn't return, an empire that would have to learn to function without his constant oversight, because he'd finally found something more important than being indispensable. "Cancel everything for the rest of the week," he told her, "and book me a flight to Houston." "Sir, I'm moving to Texas." The words felt like jumping off a cliff, but for the first time in years, Richard wasn't afraid of the landing. The board meeting ultimatum was simple: return to Atlanta immediately or lose controlling interest in his company. Richard looked at the photos of his daughters on his phone, then at his business partners. "Gentlemen," he said, loosening his tie, "let me tell you about the only investment that really matters." The moving truck sat in Richard's Atlanta driveway like a metal monument to the most expensive decision of his life. 3 months of board meetings, emergency sessions, and heated arguments had led to this moment. Watching strangers load his penthouse into cardboard boxes while his phone buzzed with messages from investors who thought he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Sane men didn't walk away from billion-dollar empires for the chance to read bedtime stories to children who barely knew their names. "You sure about this, boss?" Tony, his driver for the past 5 years, secured the last box in the truck with the careful attention of someone handling fragile dreams. Richard looked back at the building that had been his kingdom, 40 floors of glass and steel that represented everything he'd thought he wanted. The penthouse where he'd celebrated deals worth more money than small countries produced. The office where he'd built an empire on the foundation of other people's dreams. None of it felt real anymore. The only reality that mattered lived in a small yellow house in Houston, where 3 little girls called another man daddy, and where the woman he'd thrown away was slowly learning to trust him with supervised visits to the playground. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Richard said, climbing into the passenger seat of his own moving truck because flying to Houston felt too distant from the life he was carrying with him. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon connecting his past to his possible future. Every mile took him further from the safety of success and closer to the terrifying possibility of failure. What if Danielle never forgave him? What if his daughters grew up seeing him as the stranger who disrupted their perfect family? What if love really wasn't enough? His phone rang. Marcus's name on the screen surprised him. They'd barely spoken since that first night at the coffee shop, their interactions limited to careful politeness during playground visits. "Richard." Marcus's voice carried something new. Not warmth exactly, but not the cold distance of those first meetings either. "Marcus, is everything okay? Are the girls?" "The girls are fine. It's Danielle I'm calling about." Richard's chest tightened. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Something's right, actually. She's been different since you started visiting. Lighter somehow. Like she's finally letting herself heal from wounds she's carried for 6 years. The words hit Richard like hope and terror combined. "I don't understand. Emma drew a picture yesterday. The family under the rainbow. But this time, there were 2 daddy figures. One labeled Daddy Marcus and another labeled Daddy Richard. She asked Danielle if families could have 2 daddies if everyone loved each other enough." Richard pulled the truck over to the side of the highway, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't expected. "What did Danielle say?" "She said some families are different, but different doesn't mean wrong." And then she cried, the good kind of crying, the kind that washes away old pain instead of adding to it. For a moment, neither man spoke. The highway hummed around them, carrying other people toward their own destinations, their own choices between safety and possibility. "Marcus," Richard said finally, "I need you to know something. I'm not trying to replace you. I could never replace you. Those girls love you because you earned it. And I need you to know something too," Marcus replied. "I'm not trying to keep you away anymore. Those girls deserve to know their father. The real you, not the man who was too afraid to stay 6 years ago." "What changed?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd wrestled with his own demons and won. "Emma asked me if I was scared you'd take them away from me. And I realized a man who truly loves those children wouldn't want to take them away from someone who's been good to them. He'd want to add to their love, not subtract from it." The truth settled between them like a bridge finally strong enough to hold the weight of 2 men who'd both learned to love the same family. "I bought a house," Richard said, 3 blocks from your neighborhood. Close enough to be present, far enough to not crowd you. Danielle, no. Not yet. I wanted to be sure I was really staying before I told her. Before I gave her another reason to hope that I might disappoint. Richard. Marcus's voice carried something that sounded almost like friendship. You've already disappointed her. The question now is whether you're man enough to do better. The challenge wasn't issued with cruelty, but with the kind of honest assessment that comes from seeing someone clearly, flaws and potential both visible in equal measure. I'm going to try, Richard said. I'm going to try to be worthy of them. Then we'll figure out together. All of us. Because those girls deserve every bit of love they can get from both their daddies. As Richard hung up the phone and pulled back onto the highway toward Houston, toward the family he'd abandoned and the man who'd rescued them, he realized this wasn't just about custody or legal rights or making up for past mistakes. This was about learning what family really meant when love mattered more than pride. The key felt foreign in Richard's hand as he stood before the blue door of his new house. A modest 3-bedroom ranch that cost less than his monthly parking spot in Atlanta, but felt more valuable than any property he'd ever owned. Through the window, he could see Danielle's yellow house, where kitchen lights glowed warm against the Houston evening. 3 blocks might as well have been 3 miles when measured against 6 years of absence. But it was close enough to matter. Close enough for emergency phone calls and school plays and the daily magic of raising children that he'd never thought he wanted. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Daddy Marcus showed us your new house. Can we help you unpack? The words hit him like Christmas morning and nerve surgery combined. They wanted to help him build his new life. These 3 little girls who had every reason to keep their distance from the stranger who shared their DNA. 20 minutes later, his front door exploded with the kind of chaos that only 6-year-old triplets could create. Emma surveyed his empty living room with the serious expression of someone planning a major renovation. Grace hung back near Danielle, clutching a plate of cookies she'd helped bake. Sophia explored every corner with the fearless curiosity of a natural adventurer. You don't have any furniture, Emma announced, as if Richard hadn't noticed his house was empty except for the boxes he'd carried in from the truck. We have furniture at our house, Sophia offered helpfully. Daddy Marcus built most of it himself. The casual mention of Marcus felt less like a knife to the chest, now, and more like simple truth. Marcus was their daddy in every way that mattered. Richard was still earning the right to any title at all. Danielle stood in his doorway holding a casserole dish, looking as uncertain as he felt. 6 months of playground visits and careful phone calls hadn't prepared them for this moment. Her in his house, surrounded by the domestic intimacy of unpacking boxes and building a life. I brought dinner, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Figured you might not have time to shop yet. The kindness felt undeserved but desperately needed. Thank you. Emma had already claimed the job of unpacking his books, creating piles based on criteria that made sense only to her 6-year-old logic. Grace arranged his coffee mugs in the kitchen cabinet with the careful attention of someone who understood that homes were built from small details. Sophia tested every light switch in the house, delighting in her power to control illumination. They're making themselves at home, Danielle observed, watching their daughters transform his empty house into something that felt lived in. Is that okay? She considered the question while Grace explained to Sophia why books needed to be organized by size instead of color. I think so. They need to know where you live now, that you're really staying. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Staying wasn't just about geography. It was about commitment, about showing up for the hard days as well as the easy ones, about proving that love could outlast the convenience that had initially defined it. Marcus arrived an hour later with his toolbox and the easy competence of someone who solved problems with his hands. He surveyed Richard's pile of unassembled furniture with the kind of assessment that separated men who built things from men who bought them. You need help, he said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered without judgment. The warning came wrapped in concern rather than threat. A reminder that second chances were precious because third chances were rare. I'm not going anywhere, Richard said. Good. Because they're counting on you now. All of them. As Marcus's truck disappeared around the corner, and Richard stood alone in his new house, surrounded by furniture that would hold his daughter's books and toys. He understood that he'd traded his empire for something infinitely more valuable. He traded it for home. The Jefferson Elementary auditorium buzzed with a controlled chaos of parents wielding cell phones like professional photographers. But Richard sat frozen in the back row, afraid that moving might somehow break the spell that had gotten him invited to his first school play. Emma was playing a sunflower in the kindergarten production of The Garden of Friendship. Grace had been cast as a wise old oak tree. Sophia, with her natural flair for drama, had landed the role of the sun itself, complete with a costume that sparkled like her personality. "You made it," Danielle said, sliding into the seat beside him. Her voice carried surprise and something that might have been relief. "Wouldn't miss it." Richard's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his phone's camera settings. "Though I have no idea what I'm doing. Do you record everything? Take photos? Just watch." The question revealed more than he intended. A successful businessman reduced to amateur status by the simple act of attending his children's school play. Danielle's expression softened with understanding that hurt almost as much as it helped. "You just love them," she said quietly. "Everything else works itself out." Marcus appeared at the end of their row, balancing a bag of props and looking like someone who'd done this before. He wore a volunteer badge that identified him as stage crew dad, because of course he'd found a way to be involved beyond just showing up. "They're nervous," he reported, settling into the seat on Richard's other side. "Emma keeps adjusting her sunflower petals. Grace forgot her first line 3 times during dress rehearsal. Sophia announced to everyone backstage that both her daddies came to watch her shine. Both her daddies. The phrase hit Richard like a gift he'd never thought to ask for. Somehow, in the months since he'd moved to Houston, the awkward mathematics of their situation had resolved into something that worked for the people who mattered most. The lights dimmed and 23 kindergartners shuffled onto the stage wearing costumes that looked suspiciously homemade but infinitely precious. Richard's throat closed as he spotted his daughters among the flowers and trees, their faces bright with stage lights and the kind of joy that only comes from knowing the people you love are watching. "There's Emma," Danielle whispered unnecessarily, as if Richard could miss the sunflower who kept waving at the audience between lines. Grace stood steady as her oak tree, delivering her dialogue about the importance of strong roots with the solemn concentration of someone taking her job very seriously. She'd inherited Richard's perfectionist tendencies, but tempered them with Danielle's gentle nature. When Sophia appeared as the sun, arms outstretched and costume glittering under the stage lights, the entire auditorium seemed to brighten. Her voice carried clearly as she delivered the play's central message about friendship growing in all kinds of weather. "That's my daughter," Richard whispered, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on his tongue. "Those are our daughters," Marcus corrected gently. "All of them." The distinction mattered less than the truth underneath it. These 3 little girls had somehow managed to create a family structure that shouldn't have worked, but did. 2 men who should have been rivals learning to be allies, because love was more important than ego. During intermission, other parents approached with the kind of careful friendliness that newcomers receive in established communities. Richard found himself explaining his situation more often than he'd expected. "I'm Richard. Emma, Grace, and Sophia's father." "Oh, you must be Marcus," one mother replied automatically. "No. Marcus is over there helping with costume changes. I'm their other father, the one who lives 3 blocks away." The conversations that followed require navigation skills he'd never developed in corporate boardrooms. How do you explain that families sometimes look different than traditional models without making it sound like a failure? "It's complicated," Danielle would say when she sensed his discomfort, appearing at his elbow with the kind of social grace that made difficult conversations easier. "But it works," Marcus would add, usually while carrying someone else's child to the bathroom or fixing a wardrobe malfunction, because he'd become the unofficial dad volunteer for any kid who needed help. The second act featured a song about gardens needing many different kinds of flowers to be beautiful. Richard watched his daughters sing about diversity and acceptance while living proof of those principles stood around him, a family that had grown in unexpected soil, but somehow managed to bloom anyway. After the final bow and the explosion of applause, three little girls ran straight to the back row where their extended support system waited. Emma launched herself at Richard first, her sunflower costume shedding glitter everywhere. "Did you see me wave?" she demanded. "I saw everything," Richard said, lifting her up despite the costume's bulk. "You were the most beautiful sunflower on the stage." Grace approached more cautiously, still in character as the wise old tree. "Did I remember all my lines?" "Every single one," Marcus assured her, while Sophia climbed into Danielle's arms, chattering about how bright the lights were and whether the audience could see her sparkles from the back row. The drive home involved two cars following each other to the ice cream shop that had become their tradition after school events. Three little girls debriefed their performance with the intensity of professional actors, while four adults navigated the strange blessing of shared custody that actually shared love. "We did good," Sophia announced from her booster seat, ice cream decorating her face in a way that made everyone smile. "We did very good," Richard agreed, and for the first time in his adult life, success felt like something that couldn't be measured in dollars or achievements. It could only be measured in small hands holding his and voices, calling him daddy, and the look on Danielle's face when she watched him discover what he'd been missing all along. The jewelry store in downtown Houston felt like hallowed ground as two men stood side by side, examining rings that would reshape their unconventional family in ways that terrified and thrilled them both. Marcus had asked Richard to come with him, not because he needed approval, but because the decision affected all of them. "What do you think of this one?" Marcus asked, pointing to a vintage ring with small diamonds arranged around a center stone that caught the light like captured starlight. Richard studied the ring with the same attention he'd once given to million-dollar contracts. "It's beautiful, classic without being flashy. She'll love it." "You think so?" The question carried more weight than its surface suggested. Marcus wasn't just asking about jewelry. He was asking permission from the man who'd loved Danielle first to love her forever. "I know so," Richard replied. "She deserves something that shows you understand her. This ring says you've been paying attention." The salesman hovered nearby, probably confused by two men shopping for an engagement ring together, but wise enough not to ask questions about relationships that clearly work despite their complexity. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the kind of whisper reserved for important confessions. "I want to ask the girls first, before I ask Danielle." Richard's chest tightened with emotions he couldn't quite name. "Ask them what? If it's okay with them if I marry their mommy. If they'd like me to officially be their stepdad." Marcus turned away from the jewelry case to face Richard directly. "And if it's okay with you." The words hit like a physical blow and a blessing combined. Marcus was asking permission to marry the woman Richard had thrown away, to officially become the father to children who should have known Richard's love from birth. A year ago, the request would have destroyed him. Now, standing in a jewelry store while three little girls were at dance class and Danielle was at work, Richard felt something he'd never expected to feel about another man marrying his ex-wife. Gratitude. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice thick with emotions that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with recognition. "You've been their father for 3 years already. You've earned the right to ask anything you want. But they're your daughters too now. This affects you." The truth was more complex than either man could have imagined when Richard first appeared across the street from Danielle's house like a ghost from everyone's past. Somehow, through playground visits and school plays and shared custody that looked nothing like legal textbooks described, they created something that worked. "They need you to be their stepdad," Richard said finally. "They need the security of knowing you're not going anywhere, that you chose them officially, legally, permanently." Marcus nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. "And what about us? This whole situation we've created? What about it? If I marry Danielle, if I adopt the girls, what does that make you?" Richard had wondered the same thing during countless sleepless nights in his house 3 blocks away. Legal adoption would give Marcus rights that biology had given Richard. Marriage would create a family unit that looked traditional on paper, but was built on foundations that defied easy explanation. It makes me their father, Richard said. Just like it makes you their dad. Family isn't about paperwork. It's about who shows up. The relief on Marcus's face was visible. I was worried you'd see this as taking something away from you. A year ago, I might have. But I've learned something about love that I never understood when I was married to Danielle. Richard picked up the vintage ring, turning it in the light. Love isn't a finite resource. The more people who love my daughters, the richer their lives become. They bought the ring together, both men contributing to the symbol of a marriage that would change everything and nothing simultaneously. The girls would gain a stepfather who'd already been acting as their dad. Danielle would gain a husband who'd proven his commitment through 3 years of presence. Richard would gain the security of knowing his family was protected by someone who'd never walk away. The proposal happened on a Saturday afternoon in the backyard where Marcus had built a swing set and Danielle had planted a garden that bloomed year-round in the Texas heat. Richard watched from his kitchen window as Marcus gathered his courage and his future family around the picnic table where they'd shared hundreds of meals. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see the story unfolding through gestures and expressions. Marcus dropping to one knee while 3 little girls squealed with excitement. Danielle's hands flying to her face in surprise. The moment when she said yes and 4 people he loved collapsed into a group hug that looked like pure joy from 3 blocks away. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Daddy Marcus asked Mommy to marry him, and she said yes, and we're going to be a real family now, and you can come to the wedding. The message contained more exclamation points than periods, but the meaning was clear. They wanted him there. They wanted him to celebrate the marriage of the woman he'd lost to the man who'd saved them all. 20 minutes later, his doorbell rang. Sophia stood on his porch holding a piece of paper covered in crayon drawings. I drew you a picture of the wedding, she announced, pushing past him into his living room. You're in it too, right here next to me. The drawing showed stick figures in what appeared to be wedding attire, with Sophia in a princess dress standing between 2 taller figures labeled Daddy Richard and Daddy Marcus. Off to the side, 2 figures in white held hands under what might have been flowers or possibly clouds. It's beautiful, Richard said, his voice catching slightly. Mommy says you might be sad about her getting married, Sophia said with the directness that only 6-year-olds possessed. But I don't think you should be sad. Love is supposed to make people happy. The wisdom of children struck again, cutting through complex emotions to reach simple truth. Love was supposed to make people happy. Danielle was happy. The girls were happy. Marcus was happy. And slowly, carefully, against all odds and expectations, Richard was discovering that he was happy too. You're right, sweetheart, he told Sophia, hanging her artwork on his refrigerator next to the other masterpieces his daughters had created. Love should make people happy. So you'll come to the wedding? I wouldn't miss it. Because family, he was learning, wasn't about who you used to be with. It was about who you chose to love now, and who chose to love you back, and how many different ways that love could grow when you stopped trying to control it and started trying to nurture it instead. The morning of Marcus and Danielle's wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Texas day that felt designed for new beginnings. Richard stood in his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time, wondering if there were etiquette rules for attending your ex-wife's wedding to the man who'd become your partner in raising the children you'd once abandoned. His phone buzzed with a text from Grace. Daddy Richard, can you help me with my flower girl dress? The buttons are being stubborn. The message came with a photo of Grace standing in front of her bedroom mirror, her face scrunched in concentration as she wrestled with tiny pearl buttons that were clearly designed by someone who'd never dressed a 6-year-old. 20 minutes later, Richard sat on Danielle's bed, their old marital bed that now belonged to Marcus, patiently working buttons through buttonholes while Grace chatted about her important responsibilities as flower girl. I practiced walking slow, she informed him seriously. Emma says if I walk too fast, all the petals will fall out before I get to the front. Emma's right, Richard agreed, securing the last button. But even if you walk fast, it'll still be beautiful. Daddy Marcus says the most important thing is that everyone feels love today. The innocent observation carried weight that probably wasn't intended. everyone feeling loved, including the ex-husband who was helping with flower girl preparations while the bride got ready in the next room and the groom paced nervously downstairs. "He's right about that too," Richard said, smoothing Grace's hair and wondering how his life had become something that required this level of emotional complexity to function properly. Danielle appeared in the doorway, and Richard's breath caught in his throat. She wore a simple cream dress that managed to be both elegant and understated, her hair swept up in a style that showed off the graceful line of her neck. She was beautiful, the same woman he'd fallen in love with 8 years ago, but somehow more herself than she'd ever been during their marriage. "Thank you," she said quietly, watching him finish with Grace's buttons. "For being here, for helping, for making this easier instead of harder." The gratitude in her voice carried 6 years of history. His abandonment, her struggle, their slow path back to something resembling friendship. She could have made this day about choosing sides or settling scores. Instead, she'd chosen to make it about family, however unconventional that family might look. "Thank you," Richard replied, "for letting me be part of it." Grace spun in front of the mirror, her dress flaring out like flower petals. "Do I look like a princess?" "You look like the most beautiful flower girl in Texas," Danielle said, kneeling to adjust Grace's headband. "What about Emma and Sophia? They look like the most beautiful flower girls in the world," Richard added, because in a family with triplets, superlatives required careful distribution. The ceremony took place in Marcus's childhood church, a small building with stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns on worn wooden pews. The guest list was intimate. Family, close friends, and the extended community that had embraced their unconventional situation with varying degrees of understanding. Richard sat in the third row, watching his daughters scatter rose petals with the kind of serious concentration usually reserved for brain surgery. Emma walked with measured steps, periodically checking to make sure her basket still contained petals. Grace moved with natural grace, smiling at guests like she was personally welcoming them to the celebration. Sophia improvised a little dance move that made everyone smile and probably wasn't part of the rehearsal. When Marcus appeared at the front of the church, his face lit with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. He caught Richard's eye across the sanctuary and nodded. Not acknowledgement between rivals, but recognition between men who'd learned to love the same family in different ways. The music swelled, and Danielle walked down the aisle alone, having chosen to give herself away rather than be given by someone else. She looked radiant in a way that Richard remembered from their early dating years, when everything felt possible and love seemed simple enough to last forever. But this time was different. This time, her joy came from choosing someone who'd proven himself worthy of her trust through actions rather than promises. Someone who'd stayed when staying was difficult and loved when love required sacrifice. The vows they exchanged were personal, written separately, but somehow perfectly matched. Marcus promised to be the father Danielle's children deserved and the husband she'd dreamed of having. Danielle promised to build a life with him based on the solid foundation of friendship and daily kindness they'd already established. "I take you as my husband," Danielle said, her voice carrying across the small sanctuary. "Not because I need someone to complete me, but because I choose someone to complement me." Richard felt tears on his cheeks that he hadn't realized were falling. This was what love looked like when it was built on truth instead of fantasy. When two people chose each other with full knowledge of what that choice entailed. After the ceremony, the reception took place in the church fellowship hall, decorated with flowers from Danielle's garden and photos that told the story of how their family had grown. Images of Marcus teaching the girls to ride bikes, of dance recitals and birthday parties, of ordinary moments that had built extraordinary bonds. Speech. Someone called when Richard stood to refill his coffee cup, and suddenly the entire reception was looking at him expectantly. What do you say at your ex-wife's wedding to another man? How do you toast a marriage that represents everything you'd once hoped for but been too proud to achieve? Richard cleared his throat, his hands shaking slightly as he raised his water glass. "Awa."
When things get hard, but the kind that shows up every day and chooses to keep loving even when it's not easy. He paused, looking at the faces around him. Friends who'd watched this unusual family form. Relatives who'd adjusted their expectations of what families could look like. Children who'd learned that sometimes adults could figure out how to put love first. Marcus, you've been everything to my daughters that I should have been from the beginning. You've earned the title dad through 3 years of midnight stories and patient homework help and being present for every moment that mattered. Marcus's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Danielle, you've shown me what strength really means. You turned what should have been the worst experience of your life into the foundation for something beautiful. You've raised 3 incredible little girls who know exactly how much they're loved. Richard's voice caught as he looked at his daughters, clustered around the bride and groom like flowers growing toward sunlight. And Emma, Grace, and Sophia, you 3 have taught me that families don't have to look like the pictures in magazines to be real. Sometimes the best families are the ones that grow from love instead of tradition, from choice instead of obligation. He raised his glass higher. So here's to the new Mr. and Mrs. Williams, and to the family they've built that's big enough to include everyone who loves these children. May your marriage be everything that love is supposed to be: patient, kind, forgiving, and strong enough to weather any storm. The toast was met with applause and more than a few tears. As Richard sat back down, Sophia climbed into his lap, her flower girl dress rustling with movement. "Daddy Richard," she whispered in his ear, "are you happy about the wedding?" The question deserved an honest answer. Was he happy watching the woman he'd once loved marry another man? Was he happy seeing his daughters gain an official stepfather who'd been more of a parent than he'd ever been? "I'm very happy," he whispered back, and meant it completely, "because everyone I love is happy." And in that moment, surrounded by the sounds of celebration and the sight of his family dancing to music that spoke of new beginnings, Richard understood that sometimes the best thing you can do for the people you love is let them be loved by someone who deserves them, even if that someone isn't you. Chapter 15. The Father He Became. Word count 1,200. 2 years after the wedding that redefined everything Richard thought he knew about family. He stood in the principal's office of Jefferson Elementary, listening to his daughter explain why she'd punched Tommy Martinez during recess. "He said I couldn't have 2 daddies," Emma declared, her chin raised with the stubborn defiance Richard recognized from his own childhood photos. "He said it was weird and wrong, and that one of you wasn't real." Principal Henderson looked between Richard and Marcus with a weary expression of someone who'd navigated family dynamics that defied traditional textbooks. In the 2 years since Marcus and Danielle's marriage, their unconventional arrangement had become neighborhood legend, not always in ways that made life easier for 3 6-year-old girls trying to explain their family structure to classmates. "Emma," Marcus said gently, "we've talked about using our words instead of our fists." "I did use my words first," Emma protested. "I told him that love makes families, not rules." But he kept being mean about it. Richard felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. His daughter, all 3 of his daughters, had inherited his fighting spirit, but they were learning to fight for things that mattered more than money or reputation. They were fighting for the right to love and be loved without apology. "What Tommy said was wrong," Richard said, kneeling to Emma's eye level. "But hitting people doesn't change their minds. It just gets you in trouble. So what am I supposed to do when people say our family is wrong?" The question carried weight that extended far beyond elementary school playground politics. How do you teach children to defend love that doesn't fit conventional molds? How do you prepare them for a world that might always question the validity of their happiness? "You tell them the truth," Marcus answered, "that families come in all shapes and sizes, and the only thing that makes them real is the love inside them." Principal Henderson nodded approvingly. "I think we can handle this with a conversation about respect and keeping our hands to ourselves." Tommy's parents will be having their own discussion about acceptance and kindness. Walking out of the school, Richard felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had surprised him with its sweetness. 2 years ago, he'd never imagined himself leaving important business meetings to handle school discipline issues. Now, those meetings seemed less important than making sure his daughters knew their family was worth defending. Ice cream, Marcus suggested as they reached their cars. I think we all survived that pretty well. Ice cream fixes everything. Emma agreed, her righteous anger already fading into the resilience that children possessed in abundance. At the ice cream shop that had become their family tradition, Richard watched his daughters argue over flavors while Marcus texted Danielle updates about the playground incident. The easy domestic rhythm felt natural now. Two men tag-teaming parenthood in ways that worked despite their complexity. "Daddy Richard," Sophia said, climbing into the booth beside him with her usual fearless affection. "Are you sad that you missed our little years?" The question came without warning, delivered with the innocent directness that only children possessed. Around them, the ice cream shop continued its normal afternoon bustle, but Richard felt like time had stopped to wait for his answer. "Yes," he said honestly, because his daughters deserve truth more than comfort. "I'm very sad about that. Those were important years, and I wasn't there for them." "But you're here for our big years," Grace pointed out with 6-year-old logic that cut straight to what mattered most. "And big years are important too." Marcus caught Richard's eye across the table, understanding passing between them like current. They'd both learned that parenting wasn't about perfect beginnings. It was about showing up consistently once you figured out what mattered. "That's right," Richard said, his voice thick with emotions that still surprised him with their intensity. "And I plan to be here for all your big years. High school and college and weddings and everything in between. Even when we're old like you?" Emma asked with a brutal honesty that made adults laugh despite themselves. "Even when you're older than me," Richard promised. The conversation moved on to more immediate concerns. Upcoming school projects, weekend plans, whether they could convince both daddies to help build a treehouse in the backyard. But Richard carried Sophia's question with him as they finished their ice cream and headed home to the yellow house, where Danielle waited with homework help and dinner preparations. That evening, after the girls were asleep and Marcus was grading papers at the kitchen table, Richard stood in the backyard looking at the swing set Marcus had built and the garden Danielle had planted. The space held 3 years of memories now. Birthday parties and scraped knees, summer barbecues, and quiet conversations that had slowly healed wounds that once seemed permanent. His phone buzzed with a text from his former business partner in Atlanta. "Board meeting next month. Your input on the Singapore expansion would be valuable. Can you fly up?" 6 months ago, Richard would have booked the flight immediately. The Singapore deal represented the kind of international growth that had once defined success in his mind. But standing in the backyard where his daughters played every day, the meeting felt like an interruption of something more important. He typed back, "Can we do a video conference instead? I have a school play that week." The response came quickly. "A school play? Richard, this is a $2 billion expansion." Richard looked through the kitchen window at Marcus helping Emma with her math homework while Grace and Sophia colored at the table. Danielle moved between them with the easy grace of someone who'd learned to love chaos when it came wrapped in family. "I know," he typed, "but I have 3 daughters in the school play. That's worth more than $2 billion to me." The conversation that followed would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. Richard explaining to former colleagues that his priorities had shifted. That success looked different when measured in bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes, instead of quarterly profits and Forbes rankings. Some understood. Others thought he'd lost his mind. But Richard had learned that the opinions of people who'd never experienced unconditional love mattered less than the voices of 3 little girls who called him daddy and meant it. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, appearing in the doorway with the quiet concern that had become natural between them. "Everything's perfect," Richard said, and meant it completely. Later that night, after Marcus and Danielle had gone to bed and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet that only happy homes possessed, Richard sat in his living room 3 blocks away, surrounded by photos of moments he'd almost missed. Emma's first successful bike ride without training wheels. Grace winning the school spelling bee. Sophia's debut performance in the church Christmas pageant. Marcus had been there for all of them, but Richard had been there too. Not as an outsider looking in, but as part of the story being written. His laptop sat open to a new email from a magazine requesting an interview about his dramatic career change. They wanted to know how a successful businessman had walked away from empire building to become a part-time father in suburban Houston. Richard stared at the blank reply box, trying to find words for a transformation that defied easy explanation. How do you describe the moment when everything you thought you wanted revealed itself as less valuable than everything you'd thrown away? He began typing. 3 years ago, I discovered that I had daughters. Not metaphorically, literally. 3 6-year-old girls who shared my DNA, but not my history, who called another man daddy while I called myself successful. The business world understands hostile takeovers and strategic acquisitions. It doesn't understand the hostile takeover of a heart by 3 little girls who teach you that love isn't something you earn through achievement. It's something you give through presence. I traded my empire for bedtime stories. I exchanged board meetings for school plays. I walked away from billions to build something that can't be measured in quarterly reports. And for the first time in my adult life, I understand what wealth really means. He saved the draft without sending it, knowing that some truths were too personal for public consumption. The magazine would want a story about redemption and second chances. But the real story was simpler and more complex than any article could capture. It was about a man who'd spent 40 years trying to prove he was worth loving, only to discover that love had nothing to do with worth and everything to do with choice. The choice to stay when staying was hard. The choice to show up when showing up was inconvenient. The choice to put someone else's happiness before your own pride. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Daddy Richard, I left my library book at your house. Can you bring it to school tomorrow? Richard smiled, closing his laptop and walking to the kitchen where Emma's library book sat beside his coffee maker, right where she'd left it during their weekend visit. Tomorrow he'd drive to her school during his lunch break, interrupt his day to deliver a book she needed, and probably stay to eat lunch with her in the cafeteria, because that's what fathers do. They show up. They stay present. They choose their children over their convenience every single day until love becomes as natural as breathing. As he turned off the lights and headed upstairs to his bedroom in the house he'd bought to be near his family, Richard carried with him the certain knowledge that he'd finally learned the difference between being successful and being significant. Success was about what you accumulated. Significance was about who you loved and who loved you back. And by that measure, Richard Cole, former empire builder, current part-time father, permanent member of a family that defied easy categorization, was the richest man in Texas. The end. What defines true success in your life? Is it what you build or who you love? Share your thoughts below, and thank you for following Richard's journey from empire to family. Sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we almost throw away.